and welcome back to the video lecture series for Philosophy 119, Ethical Leadership, offered through the Pennsylvania State University. I'm Dr. William Behun. In our last session, we discussed Plato's myth of the cave, and we made the claim that it represents the process of the education of the leader in Plato's ideal city. Now, as I've understood Plato's curriculum, and I admit that I may be applying something of my own contemporary prejudices to his system, I believe that some sort of basic education is made available to the youth in the society. However, after this general education has been completed, a more rigorous and more intensive curriculum is made available. This curriculum serves two fundamental purposes. Now, in the first place, it is pedagogical or didactic. That is to say, it has to do with the education and training of the student. But it is also, I believe, probationary. This means that it is a testing process in order to determine one's appropriate place within the society. If we think back to the myth of the metals in the end of Book 3, we remember that society was to be segregated into 4 cooperating social classes. It seems reasonable, given that the distinction between the classes is made purely on the grounds of the nature of the rational soul. And the rational soul is manifested, if you will, in the intellectual development of reason and the intellectual capacities of an individual, that the determination of class, gold, silver, bronze, or iron, the metal in one's soul, should be made on the basis of one's advancement in the educational system. I would surmise that there's a natural stopping place for each class, and that point at which one either finds no further interest in the educational process, or due to difficulty is unable to complete it, would indicate the place where that person belongs in the society. So, of what does this educational system consist? Even if we surmise that this curriculum begins in late childhood, say between the ages of 15 and 18, its completion will take most of a lifetime. Now, remember that Plato has already made the claim that those with experience and maturity should rule over those who are younger and more inexperienced. So it's easy to conclude from this that those who complete the training laid out and become the guardians of society, or the philosopher kings, will be of substantial age. The curriculum begins with 2 to 3 years of training in music and poetry. And while this may seem strange for somebody who sees Plato simply as a rationalist, or somebody completely invested in reason, it makes sense given that training in music and poetry is intended to introduce into the soul a kind of gracefulness and harmony. This has been mentioned in Book 3 of Republic. As we said there's also a need to balance the affective, emotional training in music and poetry with physical training, or what Plato calls gymnastic. Now, this is not going to be an easy regimen for the participants in the 2 to 3 years that they'll be pursuing physical training. In fact, Plato makes the point that they'll be so exhausted by the physical discipline as to have no time for anything else. After the completion of physical training, we begin to see the truly intellectual training of the student begin. The next step in the process is 5 years of mathematics in arithmetic, planar geometry, that is to say geometry in 2 dimensions, solid geometry or geometry in 3 dimensions, and what we might call geometry in 4 dimensions, that is to say astronomy. I think that we wouldn't be remiss in thinking that this section consists of general training in mathematics and the sciences. After this, we reach the philosophical stage of the student's training, and the student will spend 5 years learning the rigors of dialectic, or philosophy, ultimately concluding with or coming to fruition in the vision of the good itself. Just as we saw that in the cave myth, the vision of the form of the good was not an end unto itself, but rather the free prisoner had to return to the cave in order to share his newfound wisdom with his erstwhile fellow prisoners, so too the potential guardian or leader will spend 15 years studying practical politics. I find it striking that it's not philosophy that's making up the bulk of the training of a great leader in Plato's society, but the very practical training in the day-to-day administration of and leadership of the community. This strongly practical dimension, I think, is something that is often overlooked in Plato's philosophy. Before we conclude, I'd like to draw your attention to a particular passage at the end of Book 7. Glaucon says to Socrates, "Like a sculptor, Socrates, you've made ruling men who are perfectly fine." To which Socrates responds, somewhat surprisingly given the age in which the text has been written, "And ruling women too, for you mustn't imagine that anything that I've said applies any more to men than it does to women with appropriate natures." Now, I don't want to cast Socrates as a kind of proto-feminist, but I do think that it bears mention that Plato includes women as leaders in his ideal society. The aim for Plato is to identify and educate potential leaders without regard for their gender, parentage, or social status. And we should remind ourselves that the potential for great leadership exists often in unexpected places.